They came on their ships. They came from the north. They came for a new life. Sounds quite easy really, doesn't it? But it wasn't. Life up north in the lands where it stays cold and the daylight is scarce was getting harder. And the more of them there was less to go around. So necessity stated that they needed to find somewhere else to live. These were hill folk, and they farmed and they toiled the land. But they'd heard from the fishermen that there was an island across the sea, but within easy reach, where the sea stayed that little bit warmer and the grass grew all year round. That was the place they needed to go. Now don't get me wrong, this was going to be no picnic. The sea was dark and leaden and cold and icy, and the waves rose and fell and rose and fell. But what could they do? The clan packed themselves up on their boats and they set off across the sea. They reached land, and that was great, but the sea was still cold and all they were faced with were bare rocks. That wasn't very inviting at all, so stay on the water they must. And the sea rose and fell, and the waves rose and fell, until they came across the green giant that rose from the shore up into the distance. And not long past it was an inlet. It was shallow and flat, where the fresh water flowed out to the salty sea. This was where they would land. So they pulled their boats to shore, and they all disembarked, and the babies were carried, and the toddlers went on shoulders, and the young people gathered the herds, and they looked at their new home. After days and even weeks at sea, their eyes weren't the best judges. It looked lovely and it looked solid, and yet they could still feel the ground move beneath their feet as they made their way away from the water and up towards the beautiful green giant that we know as Black Coombe. As they made their way up the side of the great hill, there was a trail that was old and well worn, and this was what they used to start the climb. Part way up, they realised that this trail was going further inland and starting to go down again, and that's not what they wanted. But just when they were giving up hope of finding the perfect place, there was a track to the left that went up, very steeply up. They started the way up there, and the gradient at first was so sharp and the wind was so cold it cut right through and took your breath. But then they reached the top, and the land stretched out before them, and the grass was green and tough, and the water trickled clear and sweet through the sundew and the moss, and the trees clung to the hillsides, and peace hung in the very air that they breathed. Just in the dip lay a circle of stones. Now, they'd had these where they came from before, and their ancestors had always used them as a place of worship and a place of gathering together as a clan. Only this circle was bigger than anything they'd ever seen. Huge slate fingers pushed out from the turf in a perfect round, with an entrance doorway that was so strong. If people had lived and worked and worshipped and were buried in this place before, then they too would live and work and worship and be buried. This was the seal that they needed to make it home. Now, time went on and years went on and life got into a normal pattern and for animals and people alike, the Thwaite worked together and people were born and people died and sometimes twins were born and then came the day when the triplets were born. 3 girls, fiery red hair. They had squabbled within the womb for space and they continued to squabble as they entered an unsuspecting world. As babies and toddlers, they fought for everything. They fought for food, they fought for space, they fought for attention. People thought that things would get better as they grew up, but it didn't. As they become children, they fought over what chores they had. They fought over whether mum and dad loved them the most. They fought about who kicked who in the teeth during their sleep. And the bickering went on and on and on. And even though they lived in the open air, with so much space around them, the Thwaite was a very tight-knit community and arguments were difficult to keep secret when you wanted to keep them secret, and the girls just weren't bothered about that. As they grew into young women, they just found more things to fight about. Whose hair was the reddest? Who had the nicest figure? Who did ale rig like the best? Not that any guy would have wanted to take on one of the sisters, for their tongues were sharp with everybody around them as they were with each other. It just started to wear thin. The parents just given up. The villagers were just tearing their hair out. All they heard all day long were screams and shouts from the 3 sisters. Eventually, the clan met within the stone circle, and a decision was made. The parents were invited in and told what had been decided, and it was actually, if I'm honest, with as much relief as sadness that they received the answer. The girls were summoned, and for the first time in years they were quiet, for any decision that was made within the circle was law, and received the blessing of their ancestors and their gods, and as well as the people in their village. The decision? The sisters would be banished. They were to leave the village and travel together until they could live in harmony together. Only then could they return. Well, stunned, the 3 sisters turned and started to walk away. They were each given a bundle of food and a woolen cloak, and they set off down the track towards the trail. By the time they reached the steep part, they'd found their voices again, and each blamed the other, because of course she wasn't in the wrong. If you hadn't done this and if you hadn't done that, because I'm perfect. It just went on and on and on. They even got to the stage of pulling hair and hitting each other. Then they got to the trail, and it suddenly hit home. They now had a decision to make that they must all make together. To the right took them down to the estuary and the water. To the left took them further inland. Or, as one sister suggested, they could make up and go back up the track, back to the village. Can you guess which one they chose? It might not be any surprise to you, but they could not agree. They argued and argued. This way, one wanted that way, one wanted t'other way, and they stood there and they bickered and they just shouted and went on and on and on, and the days turned into nights, turned into days, turned into nights, turned into weeks, turned into months, and eventually they ran out of breath, and a sulk hung over them. Now, you might think that was the perfect time for them to maybe start to talk and work out a decision, but they'd been there for that long that they'd taken root on the spot. If they'd wanted to move, they couldn't. They were stuck right at the junction of the track and the trail. This, to begin with, set up a whole new spark of arguing, but that didn't last too long because, you know, this was the result of their feuding. This was what happens when they carried on the way that they did. Mother had always said that resentment wouldn't lead to any good, and maybe they should have listened to their mother. For here they were stuck in this place. But it was then that they started to take in their surroundings. You know, this really was a beautiful place to be. If you looked down, you saw the estuary, and it filled and emptied and filled and emptied with the constant rhythm that just went with your heartbeat. And when it was emptied, the floor of the estuary was riddled with veins of crystal as the tributaries marbled their way to the sea. And every night the sun went to bed under the sea, but not before it sent the sky burning red and orange and yellow. And you know, those birds sounded lovely. And as each sister noticed something new, she found herself leaning in to the others to point it out, to stretch over there. And the winter came, and the snow and the hail and the rain, and it battered the sisters. And so they started to put their arms around each other and lean in close together. And you know, before long, they no longer felt the rain and the wind and the snow. Blackcomb is there for all to visit, and on Blackcomb you will find a trail, and leading off the trail is a track. Go up and over the track and you will find that the stone circle is still there. It still stretches up and stands strong and proud, and the grass is still green, and the water still trickles through the grass, and the cows still graze on the meadow, and the peace still hangs in the air. And there, at the junction of the track and the trail, you'll find a tree. A tree like any other, you might say, but look a little bit closer. For the tree started out not as one, but as three. 3 saplings grown up and grown together to become one and live in perfect harmony. The Swinside Sisters.